August 6th, 1945, 8:15 in the morning. In a fraction of a second, the city of Hiroshima ceased to exist as it had been. But this story is not about the moment of destruction. It is about the 9 days that followed, when the men who had led an empire into war came to understand what they had been fighting against all along. This is the story of how Japan's high command learned the truth, not gradually, but in stages of psychological collapse, from disbelief to comprehension, from comprehension to despair, and from despair to a surrender that saved what remained of a nation. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima was not simply a military action. It was a revelation, a moment when the assumptions that had sustained an entire war effort collapsed under the weight of a single, undeniable fact. Japan had been fighting an enemy they never truly understood. Part 1. The Silence. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6th, 1945, the Enola Gay, a B-29 superfortress piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, released a single bomb over the city of Hiroshima. The weapon, called Little Boy, contained 64 kilograms of uranium-235. It detonated 1,900 feet above the city with a force equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The fireball reached temperatures approaching the surface of the sun, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 degrees Celsius. In the first second, every person within a mile of the hypercenter was vaporized. Their shadows burned into concrete walls, and pavement were the only evidence they had existed. The blast wave traveled outward at over 700 miles per hour, obliterating wooden structures and collapsing reinforced concrete buildings up to 2 miles from ground zero. Within minutes, firestorms ignited across the city. The rising heat created a powerful updraft that pulled air inward from all directions, feeding the flames. People who had survived the initial blast found themselves pulled toward the fires by winds approaching 100 miles per hour. Those who made it to the rivers, seeking relief from the heat, drowned in water choked with debris and bodies. By mid-morning, roughly 80,000 people were dead. By the end of the year, that number would exceed 140,000, as radiation sickness claimed those who had survived the blast. But in Tokyo, 300 miles to the northeast, the mourning continued as it had for years. General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff, arrived at his office at 8:30 a.m., 15 minutes after Hiroshima had been erased. He did not know this yet. None of them did. Communications with the city had simply stopped. This was not immediately alarming. American B-29 raids had been disrupting communications across Japan for months. Entire cities had been burned by incendiary attacks. The firebombing of Tokyo in March had killed over 100,000 people in a single night. The war had become a grinding routine of destruction and endurance. But there was something different about the silence from Hiroshima. It was absolute. No fire reports, no casualty estimates, no panicked radio transmissions from the 2nd Army headquarters stationed in the city. The military communications hub, responsible for coordinating defenses across Western Japan, had gone completely dark. By 9 a.m., officers in the Imperial General Headquarters began making inquiries. The Osaka Regional Command reported that they had lost all contact with Hiroshima. The Hiroshima weather station, which had been transmitting regular reports, had ceased broadcasting mid-sentence. Railway officials reported that the morning train from Hiroshima had failed to arrive at its first stop, 17 miles east of the city. At 10:30 a.m., General Umezu convened an emergency briefing. The reports were fragmentary and contradictory. Some suggested a massive air raid. Others speculated about a possible ammunition depot explosion. One report, dismissed as impossible, claimed that a single aircraft had been spotted over the city moments before communications ceased. By noon, reconnaissance aircraft were dispatched from nearby air bases. The pilots were instructed to assess the damage and report back immediately. What they saw, approaching Hiroshima from the east, was incomprehensible. The entire city center had been replaced by a flat expanse of ash and rubble. Fires burned in every direction. A mushroom-shaped cloud of smoke and debris towered over the ruins, rising to an altitude of 40,000 feet. From 10 miles away, the pilots could feel heat radiating from the burning city. One pilot's report, preserved in military archives, described the scene. The entire city appears to be covered in smoke and flame. I can see no structures remaining standing in the city center. The damage extends for miles in all directions. The scale of destruction is beyond anything I have witnessed in this war. I can only conclude that the Americans have developed a weapon of unprecedented power, beyond anything. This phrase would be repeated often in the hours that followed, because the language of conventional warfare was insufficient to describe what had happened. By early afternoon, fragments of information began reaching Tokyo through military channels. A single aircraft had been detected approaching Hiroshima around 8 a.m. Air raid sirens had sounded, but the all clear had been given when only 3 aircraft were spotted at high altitude. This was a common reconnaissance formation. There had been no reason to expect an attack. Then, at 8:15, witnesses reported seeing a brilliant flash of light, brighter than the sun. Those who had been looking toward the city center were instantly blinded. The flash was followed seconds later by a shock wave that shattered windows miles from the city center. Then came the sound, a deep roar that one survivor compared to the universe splitting open. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo received the first coherent military report around 3 p.m. He read it twice, set it down, and requested immediate confirmation. The confirmation came an hour later, and it was worse. Initial casualty estimates were impossible to calculate because the agencies responsible for counting the dead had themselves been annihilated. The Second Army headquarters had been destroyed. The city government had been destroyed. The police, fire departments, and hospitals had been destroyed. The word that began circulating through the halls of the Imperial General Headquarters was not bomb or raid, but weapon. As if even the language they had used throughout the war was insufficient for what had happened. That evening, Emperor Hirohito was briefed on the situation by Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki and the Imperial Household Minister. According to those present, the Emperor listened in silence, his face expressionless. He asked only 2 questions. How many casualties? And was there any indication of what weapon had been used? The answers were unsatisfying. Casualties were estimated in the tens of thousands, but no accurate count was possible. As for the weapon, there was only speculation. Some suggested a massive conventional bomb. Others wondered if the Americans had somehow detonated an ammunition depot or fuel storage facility. A few mentioned rumors of a new type of weapon, something atomic in nature, but this seemed too fantastical to be credible. The Emperor dismissed his advisors with a single statement. We must study this carefully. Study as if understanding might change what had already occurred. As if knowledge could reverse the death of a city. But that night, as reports continued to filter in from Hiroshima, the scope of the disaster became clearer. This was not an air raid. This was not an accident. This was something new. Something that changed the fundamental calculus of the war. And somewhere in the depths of the Imperial General Headquarters, a few officers began to whisper a question that had been unthinkable just hours before. If the Americans could do this to one city, what was to stop them from doing it to 10, to 20, to every city in Japan? Part 2. The mechanism of denial in the military culture of Imperial Japan. Accepting the unacceptable required a process. It required evidence, deliberation, and most importantly, consensus. Decisions were not made by individuals, but by committees. Not through debate, but through the patient building of agreement. This system had served Japan well in peacetime. It prevented rash decisions, honored tradition, and maintained social harmony. But in war, particularly in a war that was being lost, it created paralysis. Japan's military leadership had spent 4 years constructing a narrative about the war. It was a narrative built on certain fundamental truths. Truths that had been repeated so often, they had become articles of faith. The first truth was that Japanese spirit, properly directed, could overcome material disadvantage. The samurai tradition taught that the man willing to die could defeat the man clinging to life. This was not mere propaganda. It was embedded in centuries of military history, from the kamikaze wind that destroyed the Mongol invasion fleet in the 13th century, to the victories of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. The second truth was that the Americans, for all their industrial power, lacked the will to endure a protracted and bloody conflict. They were soft, accustomed to luxury, unwilling to accept the level of sacrifice required for victory. The longer the war continued, the more likely American public opinion would force a negotiated peace. The third truth was that the emperor embodied the nation, and that his divine protection would manifest at the moment of greatest crisis. This was not a metaphor. In the Shinto tradition, the emperor was the direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. His existence guaranteed the continuity of Japan itself. These three truths had sustained Japanese war planners through years of strategic reverses: the loss of Guadalcanal, the destruction of the combined fleet at Midway.
Dr. Yoshino was one of Japan's leading physicists. He had studied in Europe, corresponded with Niels Bohr, and understood the theoretical principles of nuclear fission. Japan had, in fact, pursued its own atomic weapons program earlier in the war, a project known as NIGO. It had been abandoned in 1943 when it became clear that Japan lacked the electrical power, industrial capacity, and uranium necessary to produce a bomb. Nishina was shown the available evidence from Hiroshima: the flash of light, the mushroom cloud, the radius of total destruction, the reports of a strange illness affecting survivors. He analyzed the data for several hours, consulting with colleagues and reviewing calculations. His conclusion, delivered on the evening of August 8th, was devastating in its simplicity. Yes, this is atomic fission. The Americans have successfully weaponized nuclear energy, and if they have produced one bomb, they will have more. The industrial requirements are immense, but America possesses the capacity. We do not. If they have one, they will have more. This sentence represented a fundamental shift in understanding. The question was no longer whether Japan could endure the destruction of Hiroshima. The question was whether Japan could endure the destruction of 10 more cities, 20, 50. For the first time, certain members of the Supreme War Council began to voice what had been unthinkable even days before: that surrender might not be a betrayal of the emperor, but the only way to preserve what remained of the nation he ruled. But this realization was not universal, and it was not unopposed. Part 3. The Second Sun. At 3:47 a.m. on August 9th, 3 B-29 bombers departed from Tinian Island in the Marianas. The lead aircraft, named Boxcar and piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, carried a plutonium implosion bomb nicknamed Fat Man. The primary target was the city of Kokuda, home to a massive arsenal complex. The secondary target was Nagasaki. At 10:44 a.m., Boxcar arrived over Kokuda. The city was obscured by clouds and smoke from a firebombing raid on nearby Yawata the day before. Sweeney made 3 passes over the city, searching for a visual on the target. He found none. Fuel was running low, and a return to Tinian without dropping the bomb was not an option. At 11:02 a.m., Boxcar diverted to Nagasaki. A break in the clouds appeared at the last moment, and the bomb was released. It detonated 1,650 feet above the Urakami Valley with a yield of approximately 21 kilotons, slightly more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. Nagasaki was home to 240,000 people. It was also home to major shipyards, the Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works and the Mitsubishi Urakami Ordnance Works. The city was nestled among steep hills, which contained some of the blast, but also channeled its effects. The intense heat caused by the explosion ignited fires across the valley. The blast wave, funneled by the terrain, destroyed everything within a mile of the hypocenter. Roughly 40,000 people died immediately. Another 35,000 would die from injuries and radiation exposure in the weeks that followed. The final death toll exceeded 70,000. But the casualty figures, while horrific, were not the strategic point. The strategic point was timing. 3 days, 2 cities. And if the Americans had 2 bombs, they had a production line. News of the Nagasaki attack reached Tokyo in the early afternoon of August 9th. The reaction among Japan's leadership ranged from shock to despair to a kind of numb acceptance. Foreign Minister Togo immediately called for an emergency meeting of the Supreme War Council. Prime Minister Suzuki agreed. The meeting was scheduled for 2:30 p.m. But before the meeting could convene, another piece of news arrived. At midnight on August 8th, the Soviet Union had declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Manchuria. Over 1.5 million Soviet troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, were pouring across the border, smashing through Japanese defenses. This was, in many ways, more devastating than the atomic bombs. Japan's strategic planning for the endgame of the war had rested on two assumptions. First, that the Soviet Union would remain neutral, allowing Japan to maintain its forces in Manchuria and Korea. Second, that the Soviets might be persuaded to mediate a negotiated peace with the United States. Both assumptions had just been obliterated. The Supreme War Council convened on the afternoon of August 9th in a state of near crisis. Present were the six most powerful men in Japan: Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, War Minister Korechika Anami, Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai, Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Uemuzu, and Navy Chief of Staff Soemu Toyoda. The meeting began with a summary of the situation: 2 cities destroyed by atomic weapons, the Soviet Union now at war with Japan, American forces preparing for invasion, and the industrial and military capacity of Japan degraded to the point where meaningful resistance was becoming impossible. Foreign Minister Togo spoke first. His argument was coldly logical. Japan faced annihilation if the war continued. The Americans had demonstrated both the capability and the willingness to destroy Japanese cities at will. The Soviets were dismantling Japan's continental armies. Food supplies were critically low. The civilian population was approaching starvation. There was no path to victory, no path to a negotiated peace, and no path to anything except total destruction. The only option, Togo argued, was immediate acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, the Allied surrender terms issued in July. The declaration demanded unconditional surrender, the occupation of Japan, and the trial of war criminals. But it also contained an implicit promise that Japan itself would not be destroyed, that the Japanese people would continue to exist as a nation. This was the best outcome available, and with every day of delay, it was becoming less likely the Allies would honor even these terms. War Minister Anami rose to respond. His counter-argument was rooted not in strategic calculation, but in something deeper: the question of honor, identity, and what it meant to be Japanese. Unconditional surrender, Anami argued, was unthinkable. It would mean occupation by foreign armies. It would mean the emperor subjected to the authority of outsiders. It would mean the dismantling of the military, the instrument through which Japan's honor had been expressed for centuries. It would mean every soldier who had died in the war had died for nothing. Even if the Americans possessed 10 more atomic bombs, even if they destroyed 10 more cities, even if 1 million civilians died, Japan must fight on. Because surrender without a climactic battle rendered meaningless every sacrifice that had come before. This was not madness. It was the culmination of a warrior culture that had defined itself through centuries of samurai tradition. Bushido, the way of the warrior, taught that death with honor was preferable to survival with shame. That the ultimate expression of loyalty was to fight to the last breath regardless of the outcome. For Anami and those who shared his view, surrender was not a strategic option, it was a spiritual impossibility. The debate continued for hours. The room was sweltering, the air conditioning had failed, and men in formal military dress uniforms sat in their own sweat arguing about the fate of the nation. Prime Minister Suzuki, a 77-year-old admiral who had survived an assassination attempt during the military coup of 1936, spoke rarely. But when he did, his words carried weight. "Gentlemen," he said, according to reconstructed accounts, "we are debating conditions of surrender while our cities are being erased from existence. By the time we reach consensus through normal procedures, there may be nothing left to surrender. The statement was met with silence, because it was true. The meeting ended at 10 p.m. with no resolution. 3 members of the Supreme War Council favored accepting the Potsdam Declaration with only one condition: the preservation of the emperor's sovereignty. 3 members insisted on additional conditions: no Allied occupation, Japanese administration of war crimes trials, and voluntary disarmament under Japanese supervision. In normal circumstances, such a deadlock would have been resolved through weeks of careful negotiation and consensus building. But there was no time. The Americans could drop another bomb at any moment. The Soviets were advancing at a rate of 50 miles per day. Every hour of delay brought Japan closer to complete annihilation. Prime Minister Suzuki made a decision that was unprecedented in modern Japanese history. He would request an immediate audience with Emperor Hirohito and ask him to break the tie. This was asking the emperor to make a political decision, something the imperial institution had avoided for centuries. The emperor was meant to reign, not rule, to embody the nation, not govern it. His role was symbolic, spiritual, transcendent. But there was no time left for tradition. There was barely time left for anything.
Part 4. The Midnight Audience. Just before midnight on August 9th, Emperor Hirohito descended into the underground bunker beneath the imperial palace. The complex had been constructed deep beneath the palace grounds, designed to withstand conventional bombing. It was a maze of concrete corridors, reinforced rooms, and hastily installed equipment. The Supreme War Council, along with additional cabinet members and advisors, were assembled in a conference room. Approximately 20 men stood when the emperor entered. The room was illuminated by harsh electric lights. The ventilation system hummed. Outside, in the city above, air raid sirens wailed intermittently. Emperor Hirohito was 44 years old. He was a small man, slight of build, wearing the dress uniform of a military commander. He had ruled since 1926, presiding over Japan's transformation into an industrial power, its descent into militarism, and its catastrophic war. The historical question of how much responsibility the emperor bore for the war remains contested. But on that night, his responsibility was absolute. He alone could break the deadlock. He took his seat. The assembled officials bowed and sat. Prime Minister Suzuki rose and explained the situation: the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet invasion, the split within the Supreme War Council, and the inability to reach consensus. "Your Majesty," Suzuki said, "the situation is critical. We require your divine guidance." What followed was not a debate, but a series of formal presentations. Foreign Minister Togo argued for immediate acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. War Minister Anami argued for continued resistance under specific conditions. Navy Minister Yonai supported Togo. Army Chief Umezu supported Anami. Each man spoke in turn, presenting his position with the formality required by the imperial presence. The emperor listened without visible expression. His face, always carefully composed in public, revealed nothing. When the final presentation concluded, he remained silent, for what felt, to those present, like minutes. In reality, it was perhaps 30 seconds. Then he spoke. "I have listened carefully to each of the arguments presented. Both positions are founded in loyalty to the nation and devotion to my person, but I must say that I agree with the foreign minister." The room remained absolutely still. To hear the emperor express a political opinion was shocking. But he was not finished. "I have studied the conditions in Japan and the world. Continuing the war can only result in the annihilation of the Japanese people and the obliteration of human culture. The atomic bomb is not simply another weapon. It represents a fundamental change in the nature of warfare. If we continue to fight, these weapons will be used again and again until nothing remains. He paused, then continued. I cannot bear to see my people suffer any longer. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The time has come when we must bear the unbearable and endure the unendurable. These words, bear the unbearable and endure the unendurable, would become the most famous phrase of the surrender. They would be repeated in his radio address to the nation. They would be quoted in history books and memorials. They would come to symbolize Japan's acceptance of defeat. But what is often forgotten is what the emperor said next. I do not believe the Americans will destroy the institution of the emperor. Their statement at Potsdam suggests they intend to allow the Japanese people to determine their own form of government. But even if they do eliminate the emperor system, even if I am tried and executed, it is preferable to the complete destruction of our nation and people. This was extraordinary. The emperor, whose divine status was supposedly unquestionable, was suggesting that his personal fate mattered less than the survival of Japan. I will do anything necessary to end this war. I will meet with General MacArthur personally if required. I will broadcast a message to the people explaining the decision. I will take responsibility for the surrender. In the silence that followed, several men were weeping. War Minister Anami, who had argued so forcefully for continued resistance, sat with his head bowed. The emperor had spoken. The decision was absolute. But implementation would not be simple. The emperor's statement needed to be formalized. A message had to be drafted and sent to the Allies accepting the Potsdam Declaration. Most critically, a recording had to be made for broadcast to the Japanese people. This had never been done before. The emperor's voice had never been heard publicly. And then there was the question that hung over everything. Would the military accept this decision? Part 5. The Hours of Doubt. August 10th dawned with an eerie calm. The emperor's decision had been made, but it had not yet been announced. In that gap between decision and declaration, anything could happen. A message was drafted and dispatched to the Allies through neutral Switzerland. It stated that Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration on the condition that said declaration does not comprise any demand which prejudices the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. In other words, we surrender, but the Emperor must remain. The Allied response arrived on August 12th. It was carefully worded. From the moment of surrender, the authority of the Emperor and the Japanese government to rule the state shall be subject to the Supreme Commander of the Allied powers. The ultimate form of government of Japan shall be established by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. This was not a guarantee. It was also not an explicit rejection. The emperor's status would be determined later by the Japanese people themselves under Allied supervision. For the hardliners in the Japanese military, this was unacceptable. The emperor's status was not negotiable. It was the foundation of Japanese identity. To place him under the authority of a foreign commander was to destroy everything Japan represented. A group of young army officers, led by Major Kenji Hatanaka, began meeting secretly. They were in their 20s and 30s, mid-level officers with no formal authority but considerable influence among their troops. They had spent their entire adult lives in the military. The idea of surrender, of seeing Japan occupied and the emperor reduced to a figurehead under foreign control was unbearable. They began planning a coup. The objective was simple: seize control of the imperial palace, prevent the broadcast of the emperor's surrender message, and continue the war. They believed, with absolute conviction, that the emperor had been misled by weak civilian advisors, that the military still had the strength to fight, that the Japanese people, if properly led, would rise up and resist the invasion. Meanwhile, on August 13th and 14th, the Supreme War Council met repeatedly to finalize the surrender. The cabinet voted to accept the Allied response. Documents were prepared. A recording session was scheduled for the emperor's radio address. But the debate was not over. War Minister Anami, while accepting the emperor's decision intellectually, struggled with it emotionally. He knew what surrender meant for the military: disgrace, occupation, trials for war crimes, the destruction of the institution to which he had devoted his life. On the evening of August 14th, Anami met privately with several of the young officers planning the coup. They begged him to join them, to use his authority as war minister to rally the army to resistance. Without his support, the coup would fail.
Anami refused. The emperor had decided. That decision was absolute. To oppose it was to oppose the emperor himself, which was unthinkable. But he also refused to stop them. He would not participate in the coup, but he would not inform the government either. He would, in effect, allow events to unfold. This decision, or non-decision, nearly changed history. At 9 p.m. on August 14th, Major Hatanaka and his co-conspirators made their move. They went to the headquarters of the 1st Imperial Guards Division, responsible for protecting the Imperial Palace. Their plan was to secure the support of the division commander, Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori. They arrived at Mori's office and demanded his cooperation. Mori refused. The emperor had decided on surrender. The military's duty was to obey. Hatanaka drew his pistol and shot Mori in the head. Another officer beheaded him with a sword. They then forged orders in Mori's name, directing the Imperial Guards to seal off the palace and search for the recorded surrender message. For several hours, the coup appeared to be succeeding. The palace was isolated, telephone lines were cut. Officers and soldiers who questioned the orders were told they were acting on the emperor's authority, protecting him from treasonous civilian advisors. The conspirators searched frantically for the recording. They knew it existed somewhere in the palace complex. If they could find and destroy it before the scheduled broadcast at noon on August 15th, they could prevent the surrender announcement. They never found it. The recording had been hidden in a safe in the basement of the palace's administrative building, in an office used by court ladies. The conspirators, assuming it would be in a more secure military or administrative location, never searched there. By 2 a.m. on August 15th, senior military commanders began to realize what was happening. General Shizuichi Tanaka, commander of the Eastern District Army responsible for the defense of Tokyo, was contacted by staff officers loyal to the government. He arrived at the palace around 3 a.m. Tanaka confronted Hatanaka directly. He explained that the emperor had personally decided on surrender, that forging orders and seizing the palace was not protecting the emperor but defying him, that this was treason. Hatanaka argued that the emperor had been misled, that the military still had the strength to fight, that surrender would destroy Japan. Tanaka's response was simple: the emperor has spoken, we obey. By dawn, the coup had collapsed. Hatanaka and several other conspirators committed suicide on the grounds of the imperial palace. Their final statement, left behind, read, "We acted out of loyalty to His Majesty and devotion to the nation. We believed surrender would destroy Japan. We were wrong to oppose the emperor's will." The numbers were overwhelming. During the war, American factories had produced 300,000 aircraft. Japan had produced 76,000. American shipyards had launched nearly 5,000 merchant vessels totaling 39 million tons. Japan had lost 2,600 merchant ships and could not replace them. The United States had developed radar, proximity fuses, the Norden bomb sight, mass-produced penicillin, synthetic rubber, and now atomic weapons. Japan had developed the kamikaze, human wave attacks, and bamboo spears for civilian defense. These were not innovations born of genius, but of desperation, attempts to compensate through sacrifice for what could not be manufactured. The atomic bomb was not an aberration in American military capability. It was the culmination, the logical endpoint of a nation that could mobilize its entire industrial and scientific infrastructure toward a single objective. Japanese military analysts reviewing the war in retrospect identified the fundamental error in their strategic planning. They had assumed that American material superiority could be offset by Japanese tactical skill, operational excellence, and spiritual determination. They had assumed the war would be decided by willpower and sacrifice. They had been wrong. The war had been decided by industrial capacity, and it had been decided before the first shot was fired at Pearl Harbor. One Japanese officer in a private journal entry discovered after the war wrote, "We fought the war we knew how to fight. The Americans fought the war they could afford to fight. These were not the same war." Part 9. The Cost of Illusion. In the quiet hours after the surrender broadcast, War Minister Gorachika Anami prepared for death. He had accepted the emperor's decision, had obeyed his orders, and had worked to ensure the military would not resist the occupation. But he could not live with what he had done. On the evening of August 14th, after the final cabinet meeting, Anami returned to his residence. He wrote several letters to family members and colleagues. One letter, addressed to no one in particular, was found on his desk after his death. It read, in part, "I believe in the righteousness of our cause. I believe in the courage of our soldiers. I believe in the honor of our nation. But I have come to understand that belief is not sufficient to alter reality. The Americans possessed a power we could not match. They possessed not just weapons, but an industrial civilization that could produce those weapons in unlimited quantities. We were brave. They were limitless." Shortly after midnight on August 15th, Anami committed seppuku, ritual suicide by embowelment. He refused assistance in the final cut that would have ended his pain quickly, instead allowing himself to bleed to death over several hours. His body was discovered by his secretary in the morning. Anami's death was not an isolated incident. Over the next weeks, hundreds of military officers committed suicide rather than face the occupation. Some did so publicly in front of the imperial palace. Others died quietly, alone. All left behind similar sentiments that they could not bear to see Japan occupied, the military dissolved, and the emperor subjected to foreign authority. But these deaths, tragic as they were, represented only one response to defeat. Most Japanese chose to live, to rebuild, to transform what remained of their nation into something new. The final casualty count from the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki exceeded 200,000 people by the end of 1945. Most were civilians. Many died instantly in the blasts. Many more died slowly from radiation sickness that doctors could not treat and barely understood. Survivors, known as hibakusha, would carry the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. But these numbers, as staggering as they are, represent only the immediate destruction. The strategic impact was far greater. Had Japan continued fighting, the planned American invasion, Operation Downfall, would have commenced in November 1945. The first phase, Operation Olympic, called for landing 14 divisions on Kyushu, the southmost home island. The second phase, Operation Coronet, would have landed 25 divisions near Tokyo in March 1946. American casualty projections for the invasion ranged from 400,000 to over 1 million. These estimates were based on the experience of Okinawa, where 12,000 Americans died in 3 months of fighting against a garrison of 77,000 Japanese soldiers. If the home islands, defended by 2 million soldiers and tens of millions of armed civilians, resisted with similar intensity, the bloodshed would have been apocalyptic. Japanese casualties were estimated in the tens of millions, not just soldiers, but civilians mobilized for national resistance. Every man, woman, and child over 12 years old had been issued weapons and assigned defensive positions. Schools had been converted into factories producing hand grenades and explosives. The entire nation had been designated a battlefield. The American military had prepared for this. Casualty estimates included projections for the use of poison gas, additional atomic bombs, and the systematic destruction of every Japanese city. The plan was to create a humanitarian catastrophe so severe that resistance would become physically impossible. The atomic bombs ended this nightmare before it began. They demonstrated to Japan's leadership that continued resistance would result not in a heroic last stand, but in the complete annihilation of the Japanese people. That there would be no Thermopylae, no glorious defeat, only systematic extermination by an enemy with limitless industrial capacity. This was the truth that Hiroshima and Nagasaki revealed, and it was a truth that made surrender not just strategically necessary, but morally imperative. Part 10. The Reflection. On September 2, 1945, Japanese officials boarded the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, to sign the formal instrument of surrender. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemutsu signed first. His hand shook as he wrote his name. General Yoshijiro Umezu signed second, his face a rigid mask. Above them, hundreds of American aircraft flew in formation, a carefully choreographed display of the air power that had devastated Japan. Behind the Japanese delegation, representatives from the Allied nations stood in rows: Americans, British, Chinese, Soviets, Australians, Dutch, French. The ceremony was brief, formal, and absolute. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, spoke the closing words. "It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past." The ceremony lasted 23 minutes. When it was over, Japan was no longer a sovereign nation, but an occupied territory subject to American military administration. In the months and years that followed, Japan underwent a transformation more profound than anyone could have predicted. The military was dissolved, the zaibatsu conglomerates were broken up, women were given the right to vote, land reform redistributed property to tenant farmers, a new constitution, drafted largely by American officials, renounced war as a sovereign right and limited the emperor to a ceremonial role. But more than institutions changed, the national identity itself had to be reconstructed. The mythology of racial superiority, divine protection, and martial honor had been demolished by the atomic bombs. What would replace it? What emerged, gradually and painfully, was a different vision of national purpose. Japan channeled its energy and discipline not into military expansion, but into economic reconstruction. The same organizational capacity that produced Zero fighters now produced automobiles. The same industrial infrastructure that built battleships now built electronics. The same dedication that had sustained 4 years of war now sustained decades of economic growth. By the 1980s, Japan had become the second largest economy in the world, not through military conquest, but through manufacturing excellence and technological innovation. The transformation was so complete that it became difficult to remember the nation that had fought the Pacific War. But the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki never faded. The cities were rebuilt, but the scars remained. The Peace Memorial in Hiroshima, constructed around the skeletal remains of the Industrial Promotion Hall, became a symbol not just of destruction, but of the determination to prevent such destruction from ever happening again. Japan became the only nation to have experienced atomic warfare, and that experience shaped its national identity in fundamental ways. The post-war Constitution's renunciation of war was not just an American imposition, but a reflection of genuine national trauma. The hibakusha, the atomic bomb survivors, became living witnesses to what atomic weapons could do, and their testimony,
Industrial power lacked the will for a prolonged and bloody conflict. That the emperor's divine protection would manifest at the moment of supreme crisis. That honor and sacrifice mattered more than production capacity and technological innovation. These were not foolish beliefs in the abstract. They were the foundations of a military culture that had produced some of the most skilled, dedicated, and fearless soldiers in history. Japanese pilots who flew their aircraft into American ships were not cowards or fanatics. They were men who believed, with absolute sincerity, that their sacrifice would save their nation. Japanese soldiers who fought to the death on remote Pacific islands were not suicidal. They were following a code of honor that valued death over surrender. But they were fighting a war that could not be won through honor or sacrifice. They were fighting an industrial superpower that operated on a scale of material production and scientific innovation that Japan could never match. The atomic bomb was the ultimate expression of this disparity. It was not simply a bigger explosive. It was a demonstration of what American industrial and scientific civilization could achieve when fully mobilized. The Manhattan Project represented the convergence of theoretical physics, industrial engineering, massive capital investment, and bureaucratic coordination. It was, in many ways, the perfect symbol of modern American power: pragmatic, innovative, overwhelming, and willing to be deployed without hesitation. Japan had nothing comparable. Not because Japanese scientists were less intelligent, but because Japan lacked the electrical power to run the enrichment facilities, the industrial capacity to manufacture the necessary equipment, the capital to invest billions in an uncertain project, and most critically, the time. By 1943, when American scientists were making breakthrough discoveries at Los Alamos, Japan was already losing the war and could not divert resources to speculative weapons programs. The tragedy of Japan's war leadership was not that they fought. It was that they continued fighting long after the outcome was inevitable, sacrificing hundreds of thousands of lives in pursuit of an impossible victory or an honorable peace that the Allies would never grant. Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced them to see what they had refused to acknowledge: that they were not fighting a war that could be won through endurance, but a war that had already been lost the moment it began. That the gap between Japan's capabilities and America's was not something that could be bridged by tactics or morale or sacrifice. That they were fighting not just an army, but an industrial civilization. The bombs themselves killed 200,000 people, but they saved millions more by ending the war before Operation Downfall could begin. This is the terrible calculus that has justified the atomic bombings in American historical memory. Whether that justification is morally sufficient remains a matter of intense debate.
But from the perspective of Japan's leadership in those 9 days between August 6th and August 15th, the moral question was simpler: continue fighting and guarantee the annihilation of Japan, or surrender and preserve what remained. When framed that way, the decision became inevitable. Not easy, but inevitable. Emperor Hirohito, in his radio address, spoke of enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. This was not merely rhetorical flourish. It was an accurate description of what surrender meant for a nation that had defined itself through military honor. To accept occupation, to submit to foreign rule, to see the emperor reduced to a ceremonial figurehead, to watch as war criminals were tried and executed. All of this was unendurable. But they endured it, because the alternative was extinction. In the decades since, historians have debated whether the atomic bombs were necessary to end the war. Some argue that Japan was already on the verge of surrender, that the Soviet invasion of Manchuria was the decisive factor, that the atomic bombs were dropped more to intimidate the Soviets than to defeat Japan. Others argue that without the demonstration of atomic power, Japan's military leadership would have continued fighting until the home islands were invaded and devastated. The documentary evidence suggests the truth lies somewhere in between. Japan's leadership was divided, exhausted, and increasingly aware that continuing the war was futile. But they could not agree on terms. The hardliners insisted on conditions that the Allies would never accept. The peace faction wanted to surrender but could not overcome military opposition. The atomic bombs broke this deadlock. They provided undeniable evidence that further resistance was impossible. They gave the peace faction the argument they needed. Not that Japan should surrender to save lives or preserve civilization, but that Japan had no choice. That the Americans could and would destroy every Japanese city one by one until nothing remained. This is what Japan's high command came to understand in those 9 days. Not that they had been defeated in battle. They had known that for months. But that they were facing an enemy with effectively unlimited destructive capacity. An enemy that could produce atomic bombs at will and deploy them without hesitation. The moment Japan understood America's true power was not the moment the bomb detonated over Hiroshima. It was the moment 3 days later when a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. That was when Japan realized they were not facing a single desperate gambit, but an industrial process. That if they did not surrender, a third bomb would fall, and a fourth, and a fifth. That the reign of ruin Truman had promised was not a metaphor, but a statement of capability and intent. And so they surrendered. Not because they lacked courage, not because they had been defeated in spirit, but because continuing to fight meant the complete annihilation of everything they claimed to be protecting. They didn't lose because they ran out of courage. They lost because they ran out of illusions. And when the last illusion fell, when the gap between what they believed and what was true became impossible to deny, there was nothing left to do but surrender and hope that something of Japan could be preserved. In the end, something was. Not the Japan they had fought for. That Japan died in the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But a different Japan, one that learned from its defeat, channeled its energy into peaceful purposes, and became a testament to the possibility of transformation. Whether that outcome justified the means remains one of history's most painful questions. But for those 9 days in August 1945, the men who led Japan faced an impossible choice, and made the only decision that allowed their nation to survive. They bore the unbearable. They endured the unendurable. And in doing so, they saved what remained of Japan from complete destruction. That is the story of the moment Japan understood America's true power. Not a story of heroes or villains, but a story of human beings confronting the limits of their power and the weight of their responsibilities. A story of illusions shattering and terrible truths emerging. A story that ended not with glory, but with survival, and with the hope that such devastation would never be necessary again.